So this is a data horror story. Next to my job at the Vrije Universiteit, I'm also very active in open data within the Netherlands. And using this open data, I also became active once the pandemic started in the Netherlands, using the available data and trying to present it to others. And that was quite a journey. So I want to take you with me through this journey from the start of the pandemic till recently. I will use a presentation to give a bit more insight. And it's about infected data in biblical terms. So we have the Holy Trinity. So we have three biblical terms to take you through this data horror story. The first one is the Genesis, of course, because it started early on in the beginning of February when we had the first case of COVID-19 in the Netherlands. At least that's the first official case. Later on, we learned that it was already in the Netherlands in January. And within the Netherlands here, we have the RIVM, which is responsible for tracking the epidemic. And they started reporting a bit later on in the beginning of March on their website. But they did it in a very ancient way. They published only the summaries and not the raw data. So people like me, wanting to use their data, had a biblical path to get it and make it reusable so to give others more insight. This is the way they published it on their website. It was in HTML and some nice charts. So from a first look, it looks okay and very interesting, but it was only in HTML and it was only the summaries. So not the full data and not the historical data. So what we had to do, we had to manually transcribe all the data that was published on their website to make it usable. Later on the March of 21st, they started to publish even more data, but now they did it in PDF format. So this gave a lot of challenges. For instance, how do you use this data? Some of the data is in charts, so you have to look exactly what the amount is on a specific date. And some of the data was in tables. But this data changed very often, because we know if somebody publishes the data in a nice latex formatted PDF, he needs to have the source data to make it available, but they wouldn't give it. So we keep on building scrapers first for HTML, but the table formats changed every now and then for the PDFs, because there was a lot of interesting details in there. What I did in these PDFs is they changed the format every now and then. So first we had a nice table about a breakdown on age for the infected people. But then on the 6th of May, for some reason, they removed the parentheses. So our scraper crashed and we had to build it again. And then we had built it again. And then in June, they changed the reference period for some reason. So instead of all the cases from the start, they started reporting from June 1st. So translating the data to our database broke again, and we had to backtrack and see how to combine the previous data with the new setup. So that was a challenge. And there were some other things like suddenly switching the order within the tables. So these are the provinces in the Netherlands. And the first time it was in alphabetical order. And the second time, a bit later on, it was in, let's say, north to south order. They never explained, they never announced changing this, but of course it broke our PDF scrapers. That meaning for us, users of the data, we had a lot of nights frustrating, doing things manually, making sure the data we presented was still correct. So the next phase, we were happy because on the May 21st, the RIVM finally started publishing open data in that were in JSON files and in CSVs. So it was way more accessible than we first could use it. So we had one day of celebration, and then we found out some more issues. And one of the very interesting issue was the resurrection of the dead people. So we had this data, we looked at it, we just pushed it to our audience, but we found out at a certain stage that it seems like the doctors in the Netherlands had found a miracle cure because they could resurrect the dead. The first one was on July 10th. We found out that instead of 6,137 deaths, the next day we had one less. So they must have found a miracle cure, because how could we explain this otherwise? But typically Dutch is not to leave it at that. We need to improve on the biblical way. So we had 2 times 2 resurrections afterwards. But by that time we found out that it was only administrative corrections. So no miracle cure, but they removed the dead people from the past because they found out they were not actually COVID related. But they didn't tell anybody which cases they removed. We had to do a lot of backtracking to keep our data correct, to see which cases in the historical data we had to remove in order to keep all the stuff in the right way. It also happens the other way around, because on one day during the lull of the summer where not a lot happened, suddenly we had a day with 20 new fatalities in the Netherlands. And this made even news headlines, this certain jump. But this is also due to some administrative backup being cleared. And those cases happened in the spring as well. But again, they didn't explain it when it happened. And so it's very frustrating to use the data and to find out why certain changes happened and when they happened. The last of the 3 biblical plagues for us was the Babylonian data confusion. The RIVM was not very consistent in, for instance, the date formats they used. They introduced all kinds of abbreviations they didn't explain first on, so we had to dig into medical publications to understand why certain abbreviations were used and what they meant. And they also used, for instance, different categories like the age groups. So in their own reporting, they used 5-year brackets, but in the open data one, they used 10-year brackets. So that made it very difficult for us to compare different data sets, because the one they had the fatalities and the others had the incidents, and we had to recombine them at the proper level. These were the 3 main challenges from during the pandemic, in a period where already a lot of people were confused about what's happening, and publishing infected data really hurts the trustworthiness of the RIVM. They were the main institute to publish this data for the Netherlands, and causing confusion by not being clear about the data and by not publishing the full data right on in the public domain was very frustrating for us researchers and as journalists and data analysts. And it also consumed loads of time. But right now it's improving. So right now we can have almost on an hourly data the proper insights for the Netherlands. But for the next plague, we hope the RIVM or some other institute responsible for some big incident will have the data prepared from the moment it starts and have let's say, a data process street in their organization to make this happen. So this was my data horror story.